Dr. Rivas-Drake is a professor of psychology and the Stephanie Johnson Rowley Collegiate Professor of Education at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Rivas-Drake.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rob, for that handoff. I really appreciate it. Okay, and oh, hold on, I need to share my screen first. Here we go. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this. I'm so honored to just be amongst these amazing colleagues, scholars, and to be able to exchange ideas as part of the symposium. The work that I'll be focusing on, as you can see from the title, Building Them Up, Racial Ethnic Socialization and Flourishing Among Latinx Youth, will indeed deal with racial and ethnic socialization, and sort of does dovetail quite nicely with Rob's presentation in that regard. It also is focusing on work that I have done in collaboration with many colleagues, students, former students, postdocs as well as other colleagues in the field. And I'm particularly excited to really think about these themes in relation to flourishing, which I think is an important issue in its own right, but it's particularly important to me when we think about racially marginalized young people. So, and one of the things that I like to kind of point out is that, you know, in 2020, a lot of people became aware of this, you know, racial marginalization, not just of African Americans, but of other groups, but of course, very salient was the African American experiences. But we can think about like just the experiences that young people have and how that's represented in everyday, you know, common knowledge. For example, looking through our headlines. And so on any given day, I can pull out numerous headlines, you know, that kind of point to how, you know, racism and xenophobia are experienced in youth lives or just manifest in our society. And these headlines precede 2020. And of course, everything that we know, you know, in terms of the racial marginalization of Black and other racially minorized individuals in this country didn't start in 2020, right? That's just, it's really part and parcel of what it means, you know, what the history of the United States is. So that's a topic for another day. But on this day, I guess I want to highlight that these experiences can be seen, you know, in terms of the kinds of how bias manifests and, you know, the traumatic experiences that young people have, people of color, starting just even in early childhood, as you can see here, and that they're exposed to proximal practices and policies pretty much every single day. Somewhere in the United States, kids of color are being exposed to proximal practices and policies that are meant to reject who they are, that are meant to exclude them, that are meant to reject who they are literally and figuratively, right? That are rejecting their physical bodies, that convey political precarity or worse, threats meant to harm them, right? And that it happens everywhere. And we also see, and this is a headline that it's about it happening everywhere. This is a headline that appeared, right, made national news from an incident that happened right outside of Ann Arbor, where I'm speaking to you from. And we also see that in the COVID era, we've also seen heightened, it was always anti-Asian hate directed at Asian American people in this country, but it has been heightened. And we know that from the recent studies on this topic as well. And it does happen everywhere, right? There's nowhere that is immune, you know, from, I like to say, from Alaska to Hawaii to Florida to Maine, there is no place that is immune to racism and xenophobia. The racism that young people live with obviously manifests at multiple levels. We can think about this as interpersonal, cultural, and institutional, you know, manifestation. And it forms what Beverly Daniel Tatum has referred to as a smog that we are all breathing in every single day. Youth encounter these manifestations of racism, right? They're different manifestations in different ways and across settings. And so in a study of high school youth in two racially diverse high schools, we asked, you know, one in the Midwest and one in the Southwest US, we asked whether they had been exposed to ethnic or racial discrimination, which is one manifestation of racism, and that's commonly studied with adolescents. And so we asked them if they'd been exposed to this discrimination as perpetrated by adults in community versus peers in school. And the data that I'm going to be focusing on from this point forward in the presentation is a focus on different Latinx communities, different Latinx youth. But I will say that a lot of the issues and themes really carry over, and I'm hoping that we can have a discussion about that as well later today and continuing tomorrow. But what you can see is that essentially they are experiencing similar levels across settings. There's little reprieve for them. And this is, again, I just want to note, is very similar when compared to their, African-American peers and their Asian American peers in these schools. In another study, another way to kind of get at, the exposure to racism and xenophobia in everyday life is by asking young people to tell us a little bit about their experiences with discrimination. We've already heard a little bit about that from Rob. Here, what you're looking at is a graph that contains blue and orange bars. The blue bars represent where the prevalence of that particular item or question in 2014 when they were about 13 to 14 years old. And then again, the orange bars represent 3 years later where they were. And just to give you an example, this item, go back, refers to hearing the comment, have you ever heard the comment, go back to where you came from, which is a very common form of foreigner objectification that young people experience. And you can see here that it increased from about 42% to 61% in that time. And every single way that we ask, we see an increase across these 3-year period, which is, again, the prime time part of adolescence. We also see the systematic increases in our latent growth analyses. So don't be alarmed by the, simple bar graphs. We obviously, did our latent growth analyses as well. And we did find that as well. And one thing that's really interesting about this as well is that these increases in exposure to discrimination or perceptions of discrimination in adolescence, their everyday experiences that they're having, were associated with their young Latinx youth perceptions that they would encounter racial and ethnic barriers in the workforce and as adults in the future. So we're seeing that they're making a link between their everyday experiences that they're having today with what they can expect to encounter as adults tomorrow. And we also see that association with foreigner objectification. So it's also clear that the evaluation of Latinx people is something that young Latinx kids, right, are aware of and that they're exposed to, right? They're making meaning of these different messages that are conveyed in society, and that it has negative implications for health and well-being. These are just like examples from my own research. We can see that with Dominican middle schoolers, the more negatively they believe that society viewed, that they're Latinx people, the lower their self-esteem and the more somatic symptoms they experience. And with high school youth who were, again, this is a multi-ethnic sample that includes Dominicans, Colombians, and Puerto Ricans, we see that this devaluation is also associated with lower academic self-confidence and lower grades, like actual grades as reported by the school. And then in a college sample, we see a similar pattern to our middle schoolers in that there are implications for lower self-esteem and more depressive symptoms of really perceiving this devaluation. And we know, and that is sort of like an example that I've, picked. These are examples that I picked from studies that I've been a part of, but there's a tremendous literature now has really burgeoned, has been burgeoning and has really grown, so that we even have meta-analyses that tell us that, interpersonal, ethnic, and racial discrimination in particular, for example, is really, harmful to youth in terms of we see, greater depressive symptomatology, associations, with less positive well-being, lower self-esteem, less, positive health outcomes, including disturbances to sleep, as documented by Tiffany Yip and her colleagues, and less positive academic achievement, engagement, and motivation. So in a lot of different ways, we see that discrimination, which is interpersonal discrimination is one manifestation of racism, is harmful to youth. And this is true for Latinx youth as well. But my title this talk wasn't about discrimination necessarily. So I want to say here that we want to know all of that information, and we can't deny that there's a lot of evidence that this is the backdrop, let's say, against which young people are growing up, that families are raising their children, and that communities, right, are raising their children as well. Let's think about it that way. And so we know from our theories, which are important ecological theories, such as the integrative model and the phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory by Garcia Cole and colleagues and Spencer respectively, that against this backdrop, communities, families, and youth themselves develop ways of coping or adapting, right, and surviving and perhaps thriving. So it's important to acknowledge that backdrop. But we have to also move a little bit, like kind of be in conversation with that backdrop, but also have the part of the conversation that is about what is happening in communities and families, where they're pouring into their kids, right? What are they supplying to their kids to be able to navigate these realities, the reality of growing up in a racist society and system. And we can think about these ways that they're doing this as strategies that they're using to build them up to support their health and to prepare them for the realities of growing up in a racist system. One way that Latinx and families and communities and others do as well, sort of engage, one strategy that they engage is something called ethnic racial socialization. And that refers to messages and teachings, right? So messages that are transmitted or teachings that are occurring in the family context that help their youth to understand the importance and meaning of race and ethnicity and of racism and xenophobia in their lives, in their everyday spaces, right? In the spaces that they inhabit and in society more generally. And these forms of socialization can and do occur at home, right? But they also occur in school and community settings. I want to just acknowledge that, although today I'm focusing on home context. These socialization experiences really serve as assets. We think of them as cultural assets that support positive development and outcomes among youth, right? Despite growing up, right, in a racist society. There are a lot of different ways that this can happen. So we can think about cultural socialization, preparation for bias. These are two areas that are very much, they're sort of the lion's share of the literature has focused on these two different ways. And I'm going to define each in turn in a minute. But I also want to bring into the mix today, into this conversation, sociopolitical socialization. So cultural socialization refers to messages and practices that families engage to help their youth form and maintain a sense of connection to their ethnic or racial heritage, and to know and understand the history and traditions, right, of those groups and of that experience. Here's an example of a mother from one of our more recent studies talking about why cultural socialization is important to her. She says, when I'm on my island, and she's talking about Puerto Rico, I believe, I feel like I'm at home, like, I belong there. I love the sound of the music, the tambores, the dance, all of that. I just feel like I'm very in tune with the whole heritage, and I bring that along to my children. Like, I want them to feel the same way I feel. Say if I listen to music and there's a trumpet playing, I want them to feel that trumpet and just be in tune with the music and love it and enjoy it. And I'm not saying that ethnic or cultural socialization always is about music, but you should know that one of the examples, like I'm trying to give you some examples of what this actually sounds like and what parents are saying. I'm going to do that for each domain of socialization today. So I want to think about, like, what are those other experiences? And in this particular case, this mother goes on to also say, I want them to know that our heritage is just like very family oriented, and we always want to be together, and we always have each other, and we're always there for each other. So one thing that is really salient to me about this example, but it's actually very commonly found in the literature, and see lots of qualitative data that shows this, is that she's wanting to convey very positive emotions about the group with which, right, she identifies and wants her children to identify with. And she's talking, right, about love and joy, right? These are messages that are being transmitted. That doesn't deny the realities, right, the backdrop that I mentioned before about racism, and, you know, and that is definitely occurring outside the bubble of these messages. But this is very important to her and to a lot of parents to convey that positive sense of connection. And also that sense of connection entails a strong family bond, which can be very protective for you. We've observed in our own data that consistently high levels of cultural socialization among Latinx families in Southeast Michigan, among parents of, these are high school age youth. Okay, preparation for bias. Preparation for bias refers to messages that convey an awareness of discrimination or devaluation that may happen in the future to the young person, and sometimes the strategies that should be used to cope with this. Sometimes parents are weaving together cultural socialization and preparation for bias, such as in the case of this mother who says, I've told them that they should feel proud about the way that they are, about where they're from, and not feel less than anybody. Nobody should bully them or tell them you're this. No, and whoever does, do not listen to them. Always be alert. I should have bolded the always be alert. That's a strategy. If someone at school says something, do not be afraid. Defend yourself well, because we're all equal no matter what. Where we come from, we're equal. The same way those people have the same rights here in the United States, the same with other kids, we all have the same rights. And this is a really interesting example where you're kind of seeing, you know, in both of these examples, actually, this parent, this is a different parent, says, I tell my children, you guys speak English well, defend yourselves, right? That they should be advocating for themselves. That one way to kind of deal with the bias that they will encounter is to A, be vigilant, and B, to advocate for themselves. One note that I want to make here is that I'm very sensitive to, you know, intersectionality, and that there are differences, and the extent to which parents in our studies have said that they actually encourage their children to advocate. And we see that parents who are who have, you know, unauthorized status sometimes are actually not encouraging their children to engage in this particular strategy, so as to minimize the risk of exposure to themselves and their families. Okay, and that brings me to sociopolitical socialization. Sociopolitical socialization refers to messages about the social and political conditions with which one's ethnic and racial group contends, especially in the US. And this can include socialization about a host of different issues. Some of the examples I'm going to show you have to do with immigration, documentation status, and broader sociopolitical concerns. And just to give you an example of, like, I live this every day. I want to say it was like 3 days ago, one of my kids turned to me and says, Mommy, what's CRT? And so we had then entered into a conversation. I'm like, this is sociopolitical socialization happening right now. I'm teaching them about CRT. Why is it in the news? What's happening? What does it mean? And how do you explain that to a 10-year-old in a developmentally appropriate way is another conversation. So often in our data, we've seen that parents with unauthorized status are talking about, you know, hypervigilance and hypersurveillance, and having to really, because of that, they're talking to their kids a lot about sociopolitical issues, right? Because it directly affects them. But we also see parents talking about helping their children to understand these different issues, even if they're not directly affected by them necessarily. So this particular parent says, you know, I noticed it was important that they understood everything that I talked to them about when they were younger, because when they ask about this and that, for example, in school, or if they're my kids, are always asking about this in the car on the way to somewhere. But in this case, they're talking about, you know, this kids bring questions to me, right? In school, they're talking to their friends about the friends' fathers, right? Being undocumented or having been deported, and they start to get curious. I tell them how the situation is so they don't start creating their own conclusions. So it's something that they feel they need to help their kids pretty much process and understand. What are these different issues? And these are slightly different from preparation for bias, and definitely different from cultural socialization, but still are teaching about the importance and meaning of race and ethnicity in the US, right? Here's an example in a recent study that's still in progress about someone responding to, in this example is a mother responding to a question that her child had about an image that she saw in the news. And she says, excuse me, my youngest one saw a picture of all the people at the border in Texas, like tons and tons and tons of people. And she was like, why are all those people there? And I said, well, people are coming from other countries where there's no food, there's no jobs, and there's wars going on. And they're trying to immigrate. They're trying to cross into the US because they're looking for a better life, but we can't have, thousands and thousands of people coming at one time, because then where are they gonna go? Where are they gonna sleep? They don't have jobs and things like that. They're kind of, just waiting for our country to let people in slowly and see if we can, give everybody things like IDs and places and, to go and jobs and things like that. And people want to come to this country for opportunity so bad that they're willing to wait at the borders versus going back to their homes where there's no jobs, there's no money, there's no food. In a study based in, let me see if I can get this to click for it. Based in Chicago, we asked 10 to 14-year-old Latinx youth, primarily Mexican heritage, I want to say majority children of immigrants, about their experiences, their identity experiences in the community settings at home, and including cultural socialization, preparation for bias, and sociopolitical discussions. And what you see here is an example of one of the ways that we ask about it using a scale or using validated scales. So for example, they said 92% said that their parents had said that it was important for them to know about important people and events, right? And people of their ethnicity or race. 44% said that their parents had told them that some people might treat them, particularly, in particular, badly or unfairly. And 73% said that their parents talked to them about problems facing their community. We found that these messages are associated with, in ways that you would, you could anticipate, with a greater identity exploration around ethnicity and race, with greater, what we call, ERI exploration, and then identity resolution, or having a greater sense of clarity about the meaning of race and ethnicity in their lives. They're also associated with, indirectly with these, Latinx middle schoolers' expectations for future community involvement. So how much they expected to be involved in their communities, and their, emerging civic engagement, attitude, and sense of accountability to members of their community. We also see associations between cultural socialization messages at home and family civic socialization, along with sociopolitical discussions. And these in turn are associated with more caring for community, so more pro-social, what we call social responsibility and pro-social orientation, so caring for community members and expressing greater concern for others. Okay, and in my college, work with college students, I want to highlight a couple of things, because now, we want to think about cultural socialization, preparation for bias, and then these messages about socio-political issues. How do they kind of work together? How could they work together? And in this particular study, we found that cultural socialization at home was associated with greater identity centrality, or ERI centrality, so the sense that this is an important part of who they are. But preparation for bias messages, right, that exposure to preparation for bias at home was associated with more negative perceptions of public regard, more awareness of language barriers to social mobility in the US, and greater awareness of economic barriers in the United States. And these are things that we usually think about as being positive, outcomes. But I wanna think about these things together, in this way. And that is that when I think about supporting individual health and individual kids, development, there is no doubt that the lion's share of the literature has focused on cultural socialism, but there's also lots and lots of studies with many groups and including many different diverse, Latinx communities, that cultural socialization is linked to all kinds of positive outcomes. And we can probably imagine, or just easily, interpret that in terms of promoting positive developmental outcomes like identity, right? And providing a sense of belonging. They're providing messages and sources of self-worth that are not defined by racial subjugation, right? And other, devaluation in society. And they do, and it does tend to be associated with positive adjustment in terms of academics, psychological adjustment, all kinds of things. So that's one part of the story. But we also can think about preparation for bias and sociopolitical socialization as helping to encourage potentially, working or being part of a process that, supports collective health. So this isn't going to show up in terms of less depressive symptoms. This isn't going to show up in terms of higher self-esteem, right? Or better self-esteem or better academic adjustment necessarily. Sometimes we actually see the reverse, that preparation for bias sometimes is associated with less, positive developmental outcomes in those terms. But we can also think about preparation for bias and sociopolitical socialization, that aspect of ethnic racial socialization, as supporting the development of, the capacity to recognize racism when it is occurring, right? And to respond to it, to understand, have a frame for it, right? And potentially, ultimately, to resist. It also helps, to provide young people with, an understanding of their positionality and privilege, and ultimately to learn things like how to advocate for yourself in your community, as well as potentially in solidarity with other racially marginalized and other just marginalized communities in general. So when I think about flourishing, I guess I wanted to put a kind of a point of discussion on the table for the whole group today and tomorrow. It's really like, where are we focusing in terms of when we, what is flourishing and who's flourishing? And to me, you really can't have a focus just on the individual, and we really want to think about them together and how these different, pathways can help us to get to not only individual youth flourishing, and young people flourishing, but collective flourishing. My colleague Josie Vanellis and I have recently, if someone's trying, I'm just going to check the chat really quick to make sure I don't have, okay, thank you. All right. We developed a model recently to kind of think about what would it mean to help support the development of anti-racism competencies and identities and competencies in Latinx youth. And for us, that means we have to contend with all of these things in the bubbles, which I'm not going to get into. But for sure, it means having critical socialization opportunities. So that means not just at home, but also in schools and communities that help them to understand how race operates and how racism operates as a system in our society. Because if we don't do that, they're not necessarily going to learn it. And as we can see, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for them to obtain that knowledge in public spheres, right? So it's just something that we think, really needs to be on the table. And for Latinx youth, it means contending with things like anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, not in addition to, and how those serve white supremacy. So to advance it, to perpetuate white supremacy. So we want to offer that, as a model, and we think that different groups have different sorts of issues that they need to contend with to be able to do that. And parents may or may not be prepared to have all of those different types of conversations, and they may or may not have the critical consciousness, for example, to be able to prepare, their kids to understand broader sociopolitical context of racism, how preparation for bias can be interpreted not just as an individual kind of event or issue, but part of a broader system of experiences that people have in their group and that other people have outside their group. So as I start to wrap up here, I want to say that, the other point of discussion, I wanted to put on the table is that we can take we can actually learn from what parents have been doing all this time. So I guess one question is like, what does it mean that in our society, parents have to engage in these different sorts of socialization, these different practices to be able to keep building their youth up? Because if you do nothing, and the status quo, right, like the experiences that they're having are ones that lead to erasure of important experiences and identities and histories that are communicating that people like them are less worthy and valuable and they don't belong here, that they are disenfranchising, and that they're leaving them unprotected, right, to that when they're exposed to the toxicity of racism and white supremacy. On the other hand, parents have been doing for a long time work to work against that status quo. Not all parents, but many, and across different ethnic and racial groups, we see that they are, through their cultural socialization, through preparation for bias, through sociopolitical socialization, they are engaging in these strategies to help, essentially do the opposite, right? To help their young people retain their sense of history and who they are and knowledge of who they are. To promote a sense that they are worthy and belong, despite what what society conveys, that they're prepared for engagement in civic life broadly, not just in the political sphere, but more broadly, and that they're prepared to recognize and resist interpersonal institutional racism. And so as I start to close here, I want us to think about, those strategies, and we're moving against the status quo, is not just to promote a sense of I am worthy, I belong, and I have agency in youth, but that they have a sense of we are worthy, we belong, and we have agency. And to help them think critically about, who's the we in that we, and if I think about like myself, or if I ask you to think of for yourself, when you think about that, and who you're trying to encourage that for, right? Like, who is in that we, and what would it take to make it more inclusive and expansive? And want to thank my wonderful, colleagues in training, my postdocs and collaborators for helping me to just think about these, for pushing my thinking. All the work that I do is in community and in service to others. And just on that note, I want to thank them and provide gratitude. And I want to thank my funders, of course, for their support of the ideas over the years that I have shared with you. And thank you for your time and attention today. And I will stop sharing and turn it back. I hope I'm okay on time.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Dr. Rivas-Drake. We appreciate it.